The flight was going smoothly. Passengers were settling in until one small moment changed everything. A flight attendant refused to help an elderly woman with her seatbelt, brushing her off as if she didn't matter. What she didn't know was that the woman wasn't just any passenger. She owned the entire airline. By the time the plane landed, the flight attendant would face consequences she never expected. Before we start, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss one. The flight was nearly full. Passengers were finding their seats as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. An elderly woman, Amanda Wells, stepped onto the plane, holding a small purse and moving carefully down the aisle. She wore a simple beige coat, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and her eyes held the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen a lifetime of change. Her movements were slow, but steady, each step deliberate as she made her way toward the business class section. There was no need to rush. As she reached her assigned seat, she placed her purse gently on the armrest and lowered herself into the chair with a soft sigh. The seatbelt rested beside her, just out of reach. She stretched her hand toward it, her fingers curling around the fabric, but it slipped through her grip. She tried again, this time using both hands, but her fingers trembled slightly, making it hard to fasten. She looked around, hoping for help. A flight attendant, Cassie Monroe, stood a few rows ahead, chatting with a group of first-class passengers. She was tall, poised, and had blonde hair twisted into a perfect bun. She was confident, almost arrogantly so, choosing who deserved her best service and who didn't. As she laughed lightly at something a well-dressed man had said, she glanced at the cabin, then moved past Amanda without a second thought. Amanda cleared her throat softly, hoping to catch Cassie's attention without disturbing anyone. When that didn't work, she spoke up. "Excuse me, dear. Can you help me for a moment?" Cassie turned her head, her polite smile faltering slightly when she realized who had called her. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, barely noticeable. She glanced at the unbuckled seatbelt and let out a quiet sigh. "It's just a seatbelt, ma'am," she said with a forced smile. "You just need to pull it across and click it in." Amanda gave a small nod. "I tried, dear, but my hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Cassie barely concealed her impatience. She glanced around, making sure no one important was watching, and muttered, "I'll be back in a moment," before turning away to continue her conversation. A young man sitting next to Amanda, Ezrin Cole, had been watching the whole thing. He was in his early 30s, dressed casually in a dark sweater. He exhaled through his nose and leaned over slightly. "I can help," he offered quietly, reaching across and fastening the seatbelt with a quick click. Amanda smiled warmly at him. "Thank you, son." Ezrin smiled back, but there was a hint of discomfort in his expression. He had seen how Cassie brushed Amanda off. He wasn't the only one. A few nearby passengers exchanged quick glances, while others pretended not to notice. No one said anything, and the plane continued to fill up. As the last passengers found their seats, Cassie walked down the aisle, checking on passengers. When she reached Amanda's row, she barely glanced in her direction. She smiled brightly at a businessman in the seat next to Amanda, asking if he needed anything before takeoff, then moved on without a second look. Amanda remained silent, her hands resting gently on her lap. She didn't ask for more attention or complain, but there was something about her stillness that was impossible to ignore. A few rows ahead in first class, a man in a dark suit had been watching the whole exchange. Callum Vance had said nothing, but his sharp eyes took in every detail. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his navy tie was perfectly knotted. He reached into his pocket and typed a message. Just like that, the course of the flight had already changed, and Cassie Monroe didn't know it yet. As the engines roared to life and the plane taxied toward the runway, passengers settled into their seats. The quiet hum of conversations filled the cabin, and the distant clinking of glasses could be heard from the first-class section. Amanda sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap, gazing out the window as the plane picked up speed. Ezrin Cole, sitting next to her, stole occasional glances in her direction, still bothered by what had happened. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his seatbelt before speaking. "She should have helped you," he muttered under his breath. Amanda turned her head slightly, offering a small, knowing smile. "People reveal who they are in the smallest moments," she said softly. No need to correct them. Life will do it for them. Ezrin leaned back, exhaling softly. He didn't know why, but something about her words made him uneasy. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, just certainty. It was as if she already knew how this flight was going to end. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Cassie Monroe walked through the first-class cabin, checking on the elite passengers. Her tone was warm, her smile bright, and her whole demeanor was different from how it had been just moments earlier. She leaned down slightly to speak with a well-dressed man in his 50s. "Mr. Blackwell, can I offer you another drink?" she asked smoothly. He nodded, lifting his empty glass. "Another whiskey, please." Cassie smiled and nodded. "Of course, I'll bring that right away." As she turned toward the galley to prepare his drink, the intercom buzzed softly above her. The captain's voice came through the speakers, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign has been turned off, and you are free to move about the cabin. Our crew will begin service shortly." Cassie moved quickly to the galley, preparing the drink order. As she poured the whiskey into a crystal glass and added a single cube of ice, one of the junior attendants, Mia Dawson, stepped into the galley. Her expression was hesitant. "Hey, Cassie," she said quietly, "did you see the passenger in 7B, the older woman? She was struggling with her seatbelt earlier." Cassie barely glanced at her as she adjusted the tray. "Yeah, what about it?" Mia hesitated. "I mean, shouldn't someone have helped her?" Cassie let out a quiet scoff. "Mira, we don't have time to babysit every single passenger. People should be able to handle something as simple as a seatbelt without needing personal assistance." Mia frowned but didn't argue. She was only 6 months into her job as a flight attendant and knew better than to question a senior crew member. But Cassie's attitude bothered her. She had seen how the woman treated first-class passengers compared to those who, in Cassie's eyes, weren't worth her attention. Shaking off the thought, Cassie picked up the tray and made her way back to first class. She delivered the drink, offering another bright smile before excusing herself. As she walked down the aisle, her heels clicked against the floor. She felt at ease, unaware that something had already been set into motion, something that would change how this flight ended. The tension in the air seemed to grow as the plane descended, the silence thick and oppressive. Cassie sat in her jump seat, trying to steady her breathing, but her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reminding her of the looming consequences. The weight of the situation pressed on her, not just from the fear of losing her job, but from the realization that she had made a mistake that had rippled through everything: her career, her confidence, and her reputation. As the plane descended toward the runway, a wave of uncertainty washed over Cassie. She found herself caught in a spiral of questions, unable to silence the gnawing doubts that seemed to echo louder with every passing moment. Would the executives truly follow through with the promised review? And, more importantly, what would Leora do now that she had maneuvered herself into such a dominant position? Cassie couldn't help but steal a glance at the back of the plane, where Leora sat, serene and unshaken, a picture of composure. It was a kind of quiet power that unsettled Cassie, how effortlessly the older woman exuded control, as if she didn't need to make a single move to command the room. That unsettling calm in Leora's demeanor was in stark contrast to the chaos brewing within Cassie. A deep, almost bitter regret settled in her gut. She realized too late how wrong she had been to dismiss Leora so easily. Her misjudgment, her underestimation of Leora's capabilities, had led her here, to this vulnerable, exposed position. Mira's voice pierced through her thoughts, a reminder that had been haunting her for days. Maybe you should stop worrying about how to fix this and start thinking about why it happened in the first place. Cassie, who had always prided herself on her ability to control every situation, who had spent years mastering the art of deflection and deception, found herself at a loss. This wasn't just a fleeting mistake, a small misstep she could brush off. This was different. This failure, this monumental lapse in judgment, was a revelation. It had laid bare a side of herself that she wasn't ready to face, a side that wasn't as infallible or clever as she had always believed. The plane touched down with a soft, jarring thud. The ground rushed up to meet them, the hum of the engines signaling the flight's end. Yet, Despite the physical landing, Cassie felt as though she hadn't truly arrived anywhere. The calm before the storm settled over her like a thick, suffocating fog. The sudden chime of the seatbelt sign shattered her thoughts. The moment had arrived, the final signal that the plane was about to land. It was time to prepare for what awaited beyond this flight, beyond the safety of her role as the untouchable professional. Cassie straightened in her seat, attempting to pull herself together, to piece together the fragments of confidence she had left. Her fingers clenched around the cold metal of the armrest, grounding herself in the present. But no amount of physical anchoring could settle the storm within. The plane taxied toward the gate, the tires screeching against the runway as the engines whined in protest. The hum filled the cabin, vibrating through the air, and Cassie could almost hear the collective breath of the passengers, her colleagues, all waiting, all watching for what would come next. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their gaze heavy, as if they all knew something she didn't, as if they were waiting for her to break, waiting for her to crack. The plane rolled to a complete stop, and for a heartbeat, everything held still. Time seemed to stretch, elongating the final moments before the inevitable. Cassie felt it in her chest, the tightness, the pressure building with every breath she took. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. Mira's voice, once a whisper in her mind, now rang loud and clear. "It's not going to be something you can walk away from." The weight of those words pressed down on her, as though they had been etched into her very bones. Cassie took a deep, steadying breath, her chest tight as she rose from her seat. There was no pretending anymore. No more masks, no more rehearsed acts of control. It was time to face the truth of what she had done, to own up to the consequences of her actions. She was no longer the woman who could hide behind a polished facade. The game had changed, and now she had to play by new rules.